Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this morning for BASF's first webinar focusing on disease control in sugar beet. We're really pleased to have a great lineup of speakers this morning, including Andrew Dear, Head of Technical Support for British Sugar, Mark Stevens, Head of Science for BBRO, Craig Green, an independent agronomist in Norfolk, and our very own Iain Ford, Business Development Manager at BASF. There are 2 basis points for joining this morning, so you should have been able to input your basis number at the start to collect those, but please let me know if any issues with that. There's an opportunity to ask questions and we'll address them all at the end, but if you think of them as you go through and want to submit them, then you should see the Q&A box below the screen. And you can enter them there or using Slido. So if you type Slido into your browser and then enter the hashtag SugarBeet2024, then you can submit your questions and we look forward to answering them at the end. So without further ado, I will hand over to Andrew Dear from British Sugar to start us off.
Thank you, Polly, and good morning, everyone. If you could move on, please, Iain. I just wanted to give you a quick update on the 24-25 crop. We've got about 102,000 hectares in the ground this year, very similar crop area size to last year. In terms of drilling, as you can all imagine, it's obviously a very wet and mild winter, and that's led to us having a very delayed drilling start to this year. The average drilling date was the 7th of April. But the good news was those seeds, when they were planted, actually went in pretty good conditions. And of course, when they hit the ground, they germinated fairly quickly. It doesn't mean that we haven't had some issues. We've had a little bit of re-drilling, which I know Mark will probably cover off a little bit later on. So to date, the crop, we've got about 85% of the crop at the established stage, and we count that as 6 true leaves. So we're a little bit behind where we were this time last year, and we're definitely behind our 5-year average. But plant populations are looking fairly good. There's always going to be crops that have struggled, but I think we're generally speaking, we're quite happy with the crop. So in terms of canopy closure, so we've now our most advanced crops are now beginning to meet across the rows, which is really good news. So that obviously helps with weed control. But we've still got some literally just hitting that 2 true leaf stage. There's a massive range of variation in crop size. In terms of aphids, and again, I'm not going to steal Mark's thunder later on, but our Cruiser SB treated crops, we're now advising growers just to inspect them again now. The efficacy of the Cruiser treatment will be beginning to run out. So if we are hitting thresholds for those crops, then you may want to consider inspecting and spraying those. Again, because of the weather, the wet weather has meant that, and cold weather has meant that the crops are, the aphids are not really flying. But again, I'll let Mark cover that a little bit later on. And with our non-cruiser crops, so we do have an option of 3 aphicides, which includes 1 under an EA. But as far as we've heard to date, we haven't heard of anyone using that 3rd spray. So anywhere between no sprays at all and 2 aphicides to date. So again, in terms of herbicides, we've had a little bit of damage. Again, the high rainfall has meant that some of the chemistry has washed through the soil profile and actually had issues with some of the plant roots, which has taken out some of the smaller plants. So that's something that's been a bit different for this year, and I know has been in at the plant clinic at the BBRO. And then we'll start our national crop survey. So we're looking at really close detail with 350 fields each year. And we look at things like plant populations, disease scores, so things like virus and those sort of things. So we're starting those counts next week, which will give us a really good indication as to how well we think the crop will perform in the future. Thank you, Iain. So just wanted to give you a very quick reminder of the contract for this year. We're still negotiating with the NFU for next year's crop. But just as a very quick reminder, so some of the benefits that the beet contract that's currently in the ground brings. So you'll be aware that we're paying £40 a tonne for beet this year with a market-linked bonus. That also, the growers have options of yield protection to cover their crops should there be any significant damage to it. We have a future link contract as part of the deal, so up to 35% of the grower's contract can be put on this future link contract. We offer cash advance. We offer frost insurance to the grower, and that's paid for by British Sugar. I've mentioned market link bonus. We offer a local premium for beet that is grown within 20 miles of the factory, and a late delivery allowance as well. If growers choose, they can either arrange their own haulage, or they can join an industry beet delivery service scheme, which enables them to take an ex-farm beet price, and we will then arrange their transport into the factory. And we offer a fully or a comprehensive range of services through our grower help desk. So all of account queries that growers may have, and our agriculture managers on farms, so all that can be sourced through My British Sugar or our British Sugar service team. And then finally, we've had a complete overhaul of our soil sampling service. So we're really proud of the changes that we've made in that area. So growers are able to source pH, nutrient, carbon testing for all their soil types, and that's across the rotation, not just the sugar beet crop. So that concludes my short piece around the factory, the crop for this year, and I'll hand back to Polly.
Super, thank you very much. That was really good to see that overview of how the crop's doing so far, and also the services provided by British Sugar. I'm going to now hand over to Mark Stevens, who's going to tell us a bit more about the viruses and diseases that we should be looking out for in the coming weeks.
Holly, many thanks indeed for the introduction, and thank you, Andrew, for guiding us through the 2024 crop, because clearly it is encouraging to see that 85% of the crop is now currently at establishment at that 6 true leaves. That hopefully ensures that canopy will continue to develop, and it's important that we look after that going forward. But we just need to reflect on the season up until this point, because it's not been without its challenges, as we all know. And if we just cast our mind back to January and February, when mean temperatures were far too high, and up to 4 degrees warmer in February than it should have been, and with very few frosts, that has consequences for sugar beet when it comes to pests and diseases, and not just only for aphids, because the lack of frost in February and then March certainly ensures that potentially powdery mildew then becomes an issue, which is very pertinent to this morning. But that warm period through January and February, along with the wet conditions, has meant that aphids were able to survive in numbers. And Andrew's already alluded to the fact about strategies for controlling those. But what we do know is that we were able to gain the emergency authorization for the use of Cruiser in 2024, and 60% of the current crop is protected. I would actually agree with Andrew in the fact that we know that it gives somewhere between 8 and 10 weeks protection, and for many of those crops sown in early April, mid-April, that period has come through. But fascinating, when you look at the dynamics of aphid migration, we were anticipating the first aphids from the Rothamsted research entomologist predictions that the first aphids will be around about the 10th of April this year, 2 weeks earlier than last year. But given that incredibly mild start, then we were seeing aphids coming into the crop in the third week of March, and that was actually very similar to what we saw in 2020, when we actually had widespread virus yellows, and we were particularly nervous that that could be a similar scenario. Although we did have Cruiser and we did have the foliar sprays, including the emergency authorization for a second insist on non-Cruiser crops. Now, we've been monitoring very closely And I'm sure many of you have been looking at the BBRO website, where we have the aphid maps, where we're monitoring at 44 sites and counting green wingless aphids on the crop, in addition to yellow water pans monitoring the winged aphids. What we've seen is aphids were building quite rapidly through the first 10 days of May, and we were getting concerned because crop was quite small at that point. But unfortunately, weather has gone against us in many respects, because it would be nice to have some warm sunshine now, but those windy, cold, wet conditions have served to suppress aphid activities. Although the good news is, many crops have been able to continue to grow and benefit from that moisture. And in recent weeks, aphid numbers have been relatively low, and it's encouraging to hear from Andrew that it doesn't appear that very many, if any, have had to go for a third spray with regard to controlling aphids in non-cruiser crops. So I don't no longer anticipate virus yellows to be at the levels of 2020. Clearly, there have been aphids, and there are still aphids in the crop, so we encourage you to check that and treat if necessary. But we're almost at the end of that period, and there are large numbers of beneficials as well within crop, which are doing an excellent job of mopping up not only the green aphids, but also the black aphids that have been evident for some of you as well. Unfortunately, given that aphids have been flying since the beginning of April into crops, we are now starting to see the first virus symptoms commercially. We started seeing those about 10 days ago. It tends to be individual plants or small patches. And as we go through the next couple of months, we anticipate that we will receive further reports of virus yellows. And we're not alone in this, because we are sort of aware of what's going on in Europe, and virus yellows in France is starting to show as well. So the good news is it won't be the major issue that we feared, but don't be surprised if you see small patches of virus, although Cruiser will have done a good job, and hopefully those sustainable spray programs that have been adopted will have also helped. Now, given that it has been a wet, mild season, that tends to favour some of the challenges that we need to be able to deal with. So we have, within the BBRO plant clinic, started to see right through May and to today things like nematodes, and not only the traditional beet cyst nematode that tends to produce the cysts, the white cysts on roots. Those wet, warm conditions have certainly favoured the free-living nematodes on the lighter soil types, the longodorids and trichodorids, and many of you will know if you have those on farm, because potentially you would have used NemGuard to try and protect the crop. But we have seen, given that crops have gone into seed beds slightly later than I hoped, with that moisture, it's enabled those nematodes to be around the root zone, and we have started to see cases of root bearding, a little bit of stunting on the back of that. And it's really worth monitoring also, because those conditions not only favour the free-living nematodes, they also favour the larval stages of beet cyst nematode, and they are also moving in the soil moisture. And if you have beet cyst nematode on farm, you've probably selected a beet cyst nematode tolerant variety. But as we go through the next couple of months, and if you see patches within field where poorer growth, stunted growth, possibly yellowing, that may be a signal and a sign of those challenges. We've also seen another problem, which is on some farms, Aphanomyces. It's a fungal soil-borne disease that you all protect against by buying seed with tachygarin, but when you get a late season warm seed beds, wet seed beds, it can lead to blackleg, and we've certainly seen that and had reports of that into the plant clinic as well. And interestingly, as this is primarily focused around foliar disease control, the good news is, as we stand in the middle of June, we have not had any reports of early foliar diseases. But we do just need to be very mindful in June that there is a disease that can be confused with Cercospora leaf spot. And that's actually a bacteria which causes bacterial leaf spot. And in the last 10 days or so, we've had several reports of bacterial leaf spot in crops in East Anglia. The symptoms can be very similar to Cercospora later in the season. There's lesions with necrosis setting in and with a black margin. And yeah, we just put some information out in the BBRO bulletin, because don't apply a fungicide to those, but we appreciate it can be challenging for identification. So remember, the BBRO Plant Clinic is there to help. But we are starting to think, as we go into July and beyond, then there will be the need to be able to protect the crop from the key foliar diseases. And when I say key foliar diseases, there's the two traditional ones that we have to remember and protect the crop against, and that's powdery mildew and rust. And then we have to think about Cercospora leaf spot, which is a disease that's really come on the radar more recently, an issue across mainland Europe, and particularly has been so since about 2016, became very evident in 2020, and is really in every field these days. And so mitigation and keeping that out of the crop is really, really important. Now, as we go into the season, anticipate potentially to see powdery mildew first. As I said, we've had very few frosts in February and March, and that's really, really important. And any opportunity for the foliar diseases to overwinter through hygiene issues, and just a plea, if there are any root remnants or any ground keepers, or even spoilage heaps that have got to this stage, we've been messaging regularly to try and minimise and get them destroyed. But interestingly, I was very fortunate last weekend to spend some time in Wales and looking at sea beet populations, and I was surprised to just see how much rust had overwintered on sea beet populations on the seashore. And that was also further supported by a comment I had this week on Wednesday at Holcombe in North Norfolk. So the foliar diseases are there and waiting on whether it's sea beet or any other beta species that may be in the environment that need controlling. Powdery mildew, as I said, tends to be that traditional first disease. And it's really important that we start to manage that as soon as we see it at the disease onset. We all know what it tends to look like, those sort of classic sort of almost like talcum powdery mildew over the leaves within canopies. Always check varieties that have a lower or have a greater susceptibility, lower resistance against powdery mildew, and that also goes for any of the variety disease interactions. So I'd encourage you just to check varieties and make sure you know where they are to be able to check the most appropriate ones first to guide any fungicide program. And then, and as I said, rust is clearly a disease that we tend to see. It tends to like slightly cooler conditions and start to see it as we go through August, September, and particularly October. And we tend to see the highest levels of rust and BBRO fungicide trials once we get into that period of time. Powdery mildew can decrease yield by up to 20% from previous trials that we've done. Rust up to around about 15%, but we don't tend to get these diseases in isolation, and they do tend to come together, and it's all about protecting that canopy and maximising the photosynthetic capacity of those leaves and keeping them healthy throughout the summer and into autumn, because what we do know is sugar beet cannot often, depending how long it's left, gain up to 40% of its yield potential from that 1st of September period onwards. And then, as I've already alluded to, Cercospora leaf spot is one that we do get very concerned about. I did trials back in the noughties with inoculated trials with this disease to try and gain some UK data ahead of any potential increase because of climate change, and it was almost impossible to be able to inoculate plants because conditions just didn't favour it. Wind the clock forward 15 years and that's very, very different. So we now take Cercospora very seriously in the UK, and it's really important that we have the strategies and the fungicides that will be able to deal with it, and broad spectrum fungicides are critical for us these days. So keep an eye out for those small black lesions on the leaf. Again, it's easy to confuse, as I said, with bacterial leaf spot, but also ramularia, which tends to be at low levels in the UK, and it's something we don't tend to see causing a big problem, but symptoms can be very similar. And as we go through July and into August, it's a disease that likes it warm and wet. So BBRO has adopted monitoring for the spores. We now have a network of spore traps, key locations, but we also produce the risk analyses as well, which now we're publishing as that potential increase of humidity and temperature puts the risk on farm, which then you can actually see through the BBRO website and through the bulletins, which is used as a server for triggering potentially the use of fungicides. So the triazole, strobilurins, and more exciting, more recently, the SDHIs serve as a really valuable tool that we need for the industry. Yeah, please, if you start to see the foliar diseases coming into crop, it's critical that we try and limit the impact of those, because ultimately, if we can keep the canopy healthy, hopefully we can keep it photosynthesizing at its most efficient rate, maximising root weight and sugar content. So that's a quick summary of the season. I hope that's been valuable, and I'll hand back to Polly and pick up any questions if there are at the end.
Thank you, Mark. That was really good, and a good reminder of all the great services that BBRO provide, including the plant clinic and the Cercospora warning system. So now we're going to hand over to Craig Green, who is an independent agronomist in Norfolk. And Craig, if you could tell us a bit about how your crops are looking so far this year, and what happened last year, and your experience with the Revastar trial.
So this year, the crops currently are a bit variable, as Mark's already said. We're seeing a lot more free-living nematode damage kicking about on our light lands, especially the North Norfolk sector. They're variable. We've got some areas as well where Venzar has been uptaken into the crop and sort of knocked it. Again, heavy rainfall events happening after sprays have gone on. Have led, and these aren't just 5 mil rainfall events, they're 50 mil, and that it has sort of led to root uptake of chemicals we wouldn't normally see being an issue in program. So we're at a variable growth stage. We've got some that are now meeting canopy, and that's really early. Very pleased with those crops, usually with a little bit more body and a bit of muck underneath them. Other crops, less fertility, and it has just suffered with the heavy rainfall events. But different challenge this year to last. If we think back to last year's beet crop, we had a 40-day drought as such, hot, dry. Herbicides didn't work at all. Things were very waxy, but the crop dealt with it okay. Then came into I think it was about the 10th of June, we had a decent rainfall event, and it's carried on being wet then all the way through harvest. So I was approached by Hugo Price of BASF to say, could I set up a trial, and in which then ADAS became quite involved, and we went through with a lightland grower. So the variety of sugar beet we grew was Wren. It's a light land site over chalk. There was over 100 acres in a field, and what we decided to do was target Cercospora. We're struggling with Cercospora control where the beet gets stressed, and the grower was very happy to oblige. So what we done was set up in-field strip trials, 2 hectares per plot, and the first week of August thereabouts was a Priory Gold application, and then we followed that Priory Gold 4 weeks later with a split treatment. So one tramline received another Priory Gold, the next tramline received a Revastar at 1 litre, and the next tramline received the Caligula, and they're all at the full labelled rate, and we had the intention of doing a 3 spray program. Hence, we started with the Priory Gold. And the idea was we were then going to come back with a third treatment and sort of marry that up. Unfortunately, come early mid-October, that plan went out the window because it turned so wet we could never get back on the field. The field was then lifted on the 20th of January. And so we took everything through yield. We monitored everything for leaf disease, and ADAS were the main drivers on that. And the standout product for me personally was the Revistar. You know, a litre a hectare. We applied it in 150 litres of water, and right to the point of lifting, you could still see it with the drone as a standout green canopy. And so my only learning point is actually on the Revistar. I would prefer as an agronomist to use that first in the programme instead of the Priory Gold. But because of the way we laid out the trial, you know, we went with the Priory Gold first, then the Revistar, and the other chemicals. But personally, I would use the Revistar first, and that's mainly also because of the harvest interval. You know, growers do tend to think and have the privilege of, I'll lift that field first, or I'll change my mind and I'll lift that field next. What ends up happening with a 28-day harvest interval on the Revistar is that might hamper the plans of the harvesters to turn up and lift that field. So we just got to be a bit wary of that. Is the negative of that product. The Caligula has a much shorter harvest interval, and therefore that would be a more suitable one if you're planning on lifting a field earlier. But that was a really good learning insight for me as an agronomist, to try all these chemicals and these fungicides in the same field and actually evaluate them. And the green leaf area of the Revistar was just a standout product. It did raise the sugars slightly, but I haven't yet had the root dig weights back from BASF. We see those next week. All right.
That's perfect. Thank you very much, Craig. And I think that answers one of the questions that's come in. Is I didn't use Revistar last year, but plan on doing so this year. I applied 2 fungicides to the area I lift before the end of November and 3 where they're lifted later. Where is the best position to put my Revistar application? So I think you've answered that one quite well. But to give a little bit more information about Revistar, we have our Business Development Manager, Iain Ford. So I will hand over to you now, Iain, to go through your slides.
Thank you, Polly, and thank you to the previous speakers. And yes, I've just got a few minutes to give you a little bit more detail about Revistar and also look back to some trials last year and provide a little bit of data that actually supports what Craig was just saying. So if I just start by giving us a brief reminder of the label for Revistar. In sugar beet, their maximum dose is 1 litre a hectare, and we can apply that twice in the season. And as Craig has said, there's a 28-day harvest interval. But one of the important factors I wanted to highlight was that we have label control claims for all of those key diseases that Mark has been describing for us earlier. So that's full control of Cercospora, powdery mildew, rust and ramularia. In terms of application, the general recommendations are applying fungicides at the start of foliar disease attack. It's important to note that all of the products that we have on the market at the moment are preventative rather than curative in activity. So the earlier in the disease cycle we can apply them, the better we can expect the results to be. So just to take a look back at some of last year's trials work, and I've got a series of photos that take you through the trial site that we had at this location last year. As you can see, it's right up against the wash, the seawall at Lutton Marsh. You can, if the screens are clear enough, just about make out the matrix of the trials towards the bottom end of the photo. But this was the trial where we had the highest levels of disease infection last year, and that disease came in quite late, but it did produce some very visual results, and very similar to what Craig was describing in his trial. And so if we start to just look at the plots to start with, then in this series of photos, we're comparing 2 sprays of the 3 main products. Now we have to appreciate that this was for experimental purposes, and as many of you will probably have spotted, it's unlikely that we will get 2 sprays of Caligula in a commercial season because of the restriction not to apply that before the 1st of September. But just for experimental purposes, we were able to compare the individual products, and so that will give us a good insight as to how products might then perform if we start to mix them in programs. So these were photographs from this trial there at Lutton Marsh. At the left-hand side, you can see the untreated plot, and I should say the photos were taken about 2 months after the second application went on. And if you clearly see the Revistar plot next to the untreated, you can see how there's a much more healthy and green leaf present in that plot. Looks far better. And there's a clear difference also to the 2 sprays of the Angle and the 2 of Caligula. That's looking at the plot overall. If we look at exactly the same plots and just zoom in a little bit more, you again start to get that impression of how the Revistar was performing really well at keeping the disease out of the crop and maintaining that healthy green area in comparison to the other products. And to zoom in once more, you might now start to be able to see some of the disease levels that are actually present. There was relatively low levels of Cospora, but there's quite a lot of rust in this trial, and you can see the differences between the treatments. So that was just comparing the individual products, and within the same trial, alongside the next door plots, we put various programs where we alternated different products with the first and the second sprays. So these photos are from exactly the same field, exactly the same trial, and we can now see again working from left to right. The very left hand side, we had the first spray of Angle or Priori Gold, which was then followed by Caligula. Then we had 2 treatments where we put the Revistar first and was either followed by Caligula or Angle. And then the other way around with the Angle or the Priori Gold first, followed by the Revistar. And finally, at the very right hand side, you can see where we had 2 sprays of Revistar. And again, hopefully you can clearly see that difference in the photographs with the very healthy green leaf there that we've got with the 2 sprays of Revistar in comparison to any of those other programs, to be honest. And similarly, if we zoom in a little bit more, we can still see how that strong green leaf is showing from the 2 sprays of Revistar in comparison to the other treatments. And again, it might be difficult to pick up, but there you can start to see the disease levels in some of those other plots. Now, it's all very well seeing those visual differences. The important factor is actually whether those differences feed through in terms of extra yield and sugar. And I'm very pleased to say that not only in this trial, but in several other trials, we have seen that as the case. The photographs that you've seen there from that trial at Lutton Marsh do reflect what we've seen over a number of seasons and at various different trial sites. And so rather than just showing you the results from one site, I've put together here results from 5 trials that we had last year where we were utilising those different fungicide programs. The first bar chart here shows you the actual fresh harvested yield in the bars, and the orange line at the top shows the sugar percentage of those plots. So you can see there that we have a nice improvement in the yield where we were using the Revistar first, and where we also used it second, as in the bar on the right hand side. The 2 sprays of Revistar were giving us the highest fresh yield, and whilst maintaining and slight improvement on the sugar content. So that just showing how the improvement in the green leaf area was maintaining that photosynthesis, as Mark spoke about earlier, which is helping to maintain those sugar contents and continue to grow the plants. But more important still, if we convert those figures into adjusted yield, which is now shown on the bars, and then importantly with the blue line, the margin over the fungicide costs, associated with the treatments. And you can see that all of the treatments were giving us a very good uplift in yield in comparison to the untreated, showing that we were getting good disease control across the board. But there was a clear difference where we were using the 2 sprays of the Revistar, as you can see. And the adjusted yield was showing us 4 tonne a hectare better than the nearest competitor, and an improved margin over fungicide costs of about £130 a hectare compared to the next best treatment. So hopefully that just goes to show how that the Revistar not only was producing the visual results, but was helping produce the financial results as well. So just a short reminder on how we would advise you to get the best out of Revistar. From a timing perspective, as I mentioned earlier, we would recommend spraying at the very first signs of disease, because we have the better control when we're looking preventative rather than curative. And from a rate perspective, we do have some rate flexibility. We would suggest using a 0.8 litres a hectare rate if we're just looking at the likes of rust and powdery mildew or ramularia. The Revistar is very strong on those diseases, but if it's particularly Cercospora that you're concerned about, then we would recommend maintaining at the litre per hectare rate, because we do see a dose response where the rates are reduced, especially for Cercospora. And also maintaining that higher rate of a litre not only gives us the best potential disease control, it also helps to keep the plant greener for longer and gives us greater longevity in that control. So from a spray program perspective, I've just shown you there a snapshot of some treatments and photographs and the results in terms of the adjusted yields. And so we would actually recommend a 2 spray program of Revistar to give us that best performance across the crop itself. And we do know it can mix very well with other trace elements, as might be necessary later in the season. So I've just wanted to finish on a couple of other slides actually, which highlight the longevity of the activity that we get with Revistar. And this was in relation to 2 trials we've done over this last 2 years with BBRO. And it relates to the fact that the 2 trials were very late lifted into January on both occasions. And if you remember back into autumn 2022, we had 2 weeks of frost in mid-December, which defoliated a lot of plants. And similarly, last autumn 2023, there was about a week of frost in December, which again affected crops. And as you can see from the series of photographs here, that the Revistar actually helped to maintain the green leaf area of the crop much better than the other treatments. I'd say within these trials, rust came in very late. We had 2 sprays of each product again, and as a result of the better disease control that we saw from Revistar, that resulted in the crops maintaining a greener and healthier canopy for longer, which meant that those crops were then better able to withstand the frost that came in, and that helped to maintain the green leaf and obviously then helped to maintain the yield. That was the photograph of the plots themselves. This was just zoomed in a little bit to give you a better indication of the plants themselves. And you can clearly see how we've got much better green leaf surviving after the frost on the Revistar. So that was it for my little section. And just to finish on a very quick reminder of the key points for Revistar. We can see good control of all of the key diseases in sugar beet. Both of the active ingredients within Revistar are giving us good disease control in cells, so it's a very well balanced formulation. When we're using it twice at a litre a hectare, it's giving us very good longevity of control, which is helping to maintain that green leaf area, and that in itself then leads on to improved yields and margins. And rate wise, as I mentioned, 0.8 to a litre, with the best results from 2 applications, as long as we're aiming to be about 3 to 4 weeks between applications. That's it for my little section, and we look forward to what questions we might have.
That's super. Thank you very much, Iain. So thank you everyone for submitting your questions. We've got quite a number to get through, so I will kick off with those now. Maybe one that's quite relevant to what you were just talking about, Iain, but perhaps something that Andrew would like to comment on. What's the scale of the impact of frost damage, and how can this affect the crops coming into the factory? Andrew, what kind of impact have you seen from frost damage in recent years?
I mean, it's twofold, really, for us. Excuse me. Firstly, obviously, there's significant losses to growers. It can reduce sugar content. It makes the crop less easy to harvest, and so harvester losses are increased. For us personally in the factory, it's incredibly difficult for us to process frosted beet. So we have to have the crowns removed from the roots to make sure that we don't have deteriorated material in the process. If we do get deteriorated roots, it can have a significant impact on filtration, and therefore it will slow the throughput of the factory down. So then it knocks on again all the way through the process to the hauliers, to the harvesting contractors, and then back down to the growers. So maintaining that green leaf area, protecting that crop is incredibly important to the sustainability of the grower and to ourselves.
Yeah, so quite a significant impact. And Craig, is it something that you have seen being a big issue in your crops in recent years?
Just remind me, but it's not something I've sort of picked up. We tend to be fairly prophylactic.
If I can just add to that, Polly, I think what's really helpful, and it was good that Iain showed the photographs at the BBRO trials, which are in central Lincolnshire. We do seem for the last 2 years have had quite cold weather in the first couple of weeks of December. That was certainly evident last year, and actually probably some of the coldest weather we experienced the entire winter. And as a consequence of the fungicide strategy, -3 is a critical temperature for sugar beet, and the longer you have that, then you'll get frost damage into the root and into the crown, which can work its way down through the root and ultimately cause Andrew at the factories major headaches with processing. But the one thing that the fungicides do is ensure that if we look after disease control, then we maintain the canopy. And that ensures then you provide a microclimate around the roots if you've got a decent canopy right through the winter. Now, it's not there forever, because clearly if you have cold spells on and off throughout the winter, then it starts to dissipate. But the one thing that we have seen with fungicide use, particularly with the 2, and we've also looked at 3 spray strategies, is that when you do get a frost event, by having that greater canopy, it lasts longer. So you gain initially from that microclimate, but you gain also from the longevity of that canopy going for longer, so which hopefully gives you further protection if there are subsequent cold spells.
Yeah, no, that's a really good summary. Thanks, Mark. And maybe if we stay with you, I have a question which I think maybe you'll be able to answer. So Labour promised to close the neonic emergency approval loophole. What would be the estimated economic impact and viability to grow sustainable sugar beet in the UK?
That's a very good question.
Quite a tricky one.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Clearly within BBRO we try to stay apolitical, but clearly as we go into the future, we've got to remember that the use of the neonicotinoid seed treatments is a short-term approach to enable the industry to find those alternative integrated pest management strategies that will control the aphids and minimize virus yellows. What is frustrating with aphids and virus yellows, it's quite a complex, and it's the 3 viruses that can decrease yield by over 50%. And we know in 2020 that the industry lost 64 million on the back of it. And it also allowed, because the crop was stressed, as a side point, widespread Cercospora infection because weather conditions were favourable for its development, and we lost further sugar and root yield. But I think where I am particularly encouraged is that we, within BBRO and collaborations more widely, there are some really good approaches that will become commercially viable. Whether that's, using genetics, and all the breeding houses are working very hard on that, and we're collaborating with those, and there's some really encouraging material coming. But it's also good to be able to see some of the insecticides, or I should really say aphicides, because they are specifically targeting the aphid and then potentially having very little impact on beneficials. And BASF have got a very good one coming along that we look forward to seeing in the UK crop as soon as physically possible. But then there's all the other mitigations that we can put in, and we're working hard, and within BBRO and my team have been looking at once again this year, whether that's endophytes or using Agrioda from France to hopefully push aphids away with smell, or more recently, which is encouraging, using colours and confusing the aphids so they don't land in sugar beet crop. So it is going to be a challenge. At some point, we will not have neonicotinoids in the crop. But what I would say is, from what we're seeing, it may not be as simple as we've been used to, but there are some really exciting technologies that I think will be commercially acceptable for many, and will hopefully keep on top of the virus yellows threat going forward.
Yeah. I guess necessity is the mother of invention.
Correct.
That's the saying, isn't it? So hopefully there'll be some things to fill the gap. And you're right, there's some really interesting research happening in that area.
Totally agree. And the other thing about virus yellows is it's not just a UK-centric problem. It affects most of Europe and other parts of the world, like California and even China and one or two places like that. So where you have a global issue, it does stimulate greater innovation and R&D spend, which we can benefit from.
Yeah, lots of brains working on the problem.
Yes.
To change tack a little bit, I think maybe this will be a question for Iain. How much more persistent is Revistar at the 1 litre rate compared to at the 0.8 litre rate?
It's difficult actually to put a definitive figure on that, because it very much depends on the conditions that we have at the time and disease pressure. The higher the disease pressure, the bigger the differences we see. But generally, when we're looking at that litre a hectare rate, we can look to something like 4 to 5 weeks of protection. And as we get into the autumn time and winter time, as disease pressure decreases and weather conditions are more favourable, that period of control can actually last further up to 6 to 8 weeks. And as you can see from those photos, we're getting good results there up to about 2 months after application.
If I may add to that, so around the trial we used a litre of Revistar, but at 100 litres of water. Now on the label you are allowed to do that, but they do say it's at your own risk. It didn't work as well on the foliar diseases or as long, and I think that is purely down to canopy density. So it really is down, when they put it on the label 150, you're getting a better leaf coverage. To be fair, how dense the canopy got because of the muck applications, I wish I'd have gone up to 200 litres. So I would, on that side, advocate putting more water on, getting more coverage.
Yes, thank you, Craig. It's an important point to not only get the timings right, but also get things like water volumes and spray quality correct, because it's the coverage that we need to get over the entire plant that's important. And where the canopies are very dense, as Craig suggests, increasing the water volume and making sure we can penetrate and get through that dense canopy will help to provide better results.
And just to add as well, if I may, I think we just need to reflect that under UK conditions, we're challenged by not only powdery mildew and rust, but we do have Cercospora. We never quite know how weather patterns are going to favour it. And once we start applying fungicides, as I said, we need to protect the canopy as long as possible. And I think conditions as we go into the future, we need to keep Cercospora out. So I do like to, from our own work within BBRO trials, we tend to go for 1 litre of product to give you that longevity and broad spectrum protection for as long as possible to minimise the risk of disease coming in, because once disease is there, it's then very difficult to stop because of the mode of actions of all the fungicide products that we have in the UK.
Yeah, exactly. If we stay with you, Mark, a question about what you were just mentioning about alternative virus control. Given colour differential between crop and beet affect aphid immigration, do any soil types tend to have lower immigration, e.g. on the black land or the sandy land? Do you see any differences?
So, good question. We know from all the previous work there are certain spectral reflectants that attract aphids. And we also know that there is work globally at the moment where you can actually use a lighter soiled diatomaceous earth that's actually sprinkled onto the leaves, which actually removes the contrast. We know that warmer soils tend to be black soils, so there is that risk. But there's nothing to say at the moment that one soil type over another actually favours or dissuades aphids. I think the overriding concern is temperature. And what we do need to be very mindful of is that the big problems in 2020, and when we tend to see hotspots, tend to be in the fens where crops are probably near things like oilseed rape, and we know that aphids overwinter next to brassicas. We deliberately target our monitoring sites again near oilseed rape because that gives us an indication. And if any of you were at cereals when I was talking on the NFU stand in Sugar Hour, I did make a comment about oilseed rape and aphids, and it was not difficult to find aphids on all the oilseed rape plots at that location this week. But it's really probably sources that are more important than aphids than soil colour. Although we do know, for example, and Andrew will probably back me on this, that from our own data we've all collected over the years, places like the Cantley factory area tend to be less affected by aphids and virus in many years, and that's partly because temperature suppresses aphid activity if the wind goes in the north and reduces aphid flight opportunities, which we clearly saw in 2023. So from the work we're doing, the colours we're looking at tend to be reds and greens and blues, and there's plenty of scientific support and evidence to do that. So we tend to be going down those rather than the colours specifically of soil types. But if there were things, hopefully would pick that up. But I don't think there's anything that stands out that would say soil type A is better than soil type B.
Okay, no, that's really interesting, and yeah, the work that you're doing with the dyes and looking at that is really interesting work. Just a couple more questions. Perhaps Craig or Mark, you might like to answer this. Given the wet, warm weather that we've had this spring, although it doesn't feel very warm at the moment, what is your prediction for disease levels this year? Do you think it'll be an elongated disease year?
Craig, do you want me to go first, or are you going to go first with your agronomy hat on?
From my agronomy hat on, I would say that the humidity level is going to be raised. We haven't had any stress to the crop in terms of drought, but I think it will be a high disease pressure year, but low perhaps for Cercospora.
So it's going to be an interesting one. It's very difficult to project what's going to happen weather-wise. We've got the moisture, so moisture favours Cercospora, but Cercospora needs two key factors: the humidity, but probably more recently from research, it's probably leaf surface wetness that's critical.
Yeah.
And then temperature. And what will be fascinating with Cercospora is the moisture probably potentially will be there. I can't really see this crop wanting for much water because plenty is already there, so it's probably going to get through to September, even if it stopped raining today. And unfortunately, I'm looking out my window in Suffolk at the moment, it's raining again, so the moisture is there. Temperature will drive whether we get Cercospora. We know that Cercospora can overwinter easily down at -40, hence why it's a big problem in America. So if temperature lifts with the moisture, the risk is there. But you do need both factors together, hence the risk maps that we put out with BBRO are critical to give that advice. It will also depend what happens. So if it dries up, then powdery mildew will potentially come in middle of July, but powdery mildew always runs out by about the 10th of September. It's then what happens to rust. Rust gains importance, and you've got to check your varieties again for their susceptibility. But rust and Cercospora are the two that I'll be most concerned about. Interestingly, in 2023, again, if we all remember, we had a week where it was over 30 degrees every day for the first week in September. That actually proved a very good fungicide for rust because it stopped it and dried it up because you lost the free water for spore development. But then once it started to get moist again after that, then rust got to levels of 60% in BBRO trials. So it's difficult to call. Every season's different, but the conditions that we have potentially do favour the foliage diseases, and whatever we can do, and depending on lift date, because that's also critical, getting those fungicides on will help keep them out and maximise canopy development. So keep an eye on the BBRO bulletins and updates as we go through the season.
Yeah, it's very good advice. And yeah, if we knew what was going to happen, then it wouldn't be so difficult, would it? But I guess it's just a case of...
It's got to dry up at some point, surely.
Certainly hope so. We've not seen much nice summer weather so far, have we? Okay, I think we've been through most of the questions. Andrew, do you have something to add?
No, not at all.
Oh, no, sorry.
No, it's okay, Polly.
Okay. Well, yeah, if there's no further questions, I'd like to thank everyone for their time joining us this morning, and a big thank you again to all our speakers who've, I think, given a really good insight into what's happening in the crop at the moment and what we should be looking out for in the coming weeks and months. So with that, I will leave you all to have a great day, and yeah, hope your sugar beet crops grow very well.